Hi everybody, welcome to the Design Engineering Summer Show Symposium, day 2, and today we're going to be exploring global perspectives on design with the Global Innovation Design Programme. So my name's Leila Sheldrick, I'm the head of Global Innovation Design, which we call GID, here at Imperial College, but also run in partnership with the Royal College of Art. So our students work across 2 different universities. And today we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the program and talking about how this program and how different global perspectives can inform designing for and with uncertainty, which is something I think hopefully a lot of people watching can sympathize with in this day and age, but something GID students have been doing since the program began about 7 years ago. So before we jump into the discussion, though, I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, to check out our website at desummershow.com. .london. It's linked here in the description on the YouTube. And you can find the work of the Global Innovation Design students of GID, but also students from our other incredible programs, Innovation Design Engineering and our Design Engineering undergraduate. For the next hour, though, we'll be chatting together and exploring the GID program and what makes it unique. So to introduce the program a bit, to give you a taster, we have a very short video to show you. Hi, so welcome back. So hopefully that gave you a bit of a view into the diversity of the kind of work today. So I'm going to be joined by 3 students who are graduating from the GID program this year. So we have our lovely panel for this discussion here. So I'm going to first let them introduce themselves and give you a bit of background. Let's start with Sophie.
Hi, I'm Sophie Horrocks, a GID graduate from the Tokyo, New York route. My background's actually in textile design. And prior to joining GID, I worked in Hong Kong at the Fabric Lab, which is a textile studio consultancy and ideological lab. And through GID, I've learned how to combine my skills as a designer with my interest in neuropsychology to understand how design can improve human quality of life through creating inclusive and intuitive experiences and environments.
Thanks, Sophie. And let's head next to Malvika, who I can see next to you on the screen.
Hi everyone, I'm Malvika Bhasin, a GID graduate from the Beijing and Singapore route. I have an undergraduate in industrial and product design from India, and before coming to GID, I worked at Deloitte Digital as a user experience designer for clients across USA. Throughout the program, I have been inclined towards exploring design as a means of facilitating well-being.
Great, thank you, Malvika. And last but not least, let's move to Robert.
Hi, everyone. My name is Robert Pierce. I'm a graduate of Global Innovation Design from the Tokyo, New York route as well. Before I joined GID, I was a management consultant for Deloitte working in Canada and the US, and my undergraduate degree is in biomechanical engineering.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Robert. And so great to be having this chat with you guys, even though we can't be in the same room. And to see that already we've got some comments coming through on the YouTube video from alumni, which is awesome to see. Greg there, and Myles, original founder and brain behind the GID program, tuning in from Tokyo. Really, really wonderful to have these sorts of messages coming in. So we are going to be just having a bit of a talk, but if you want to ask us questions, if you want to submit anything in the discussion, please just use the chat and we'll weave them into the conversation as we go and try and answer any questions that you have. But to give a bit of a background to those who might not know the program, GID is a bit of a strange beast. So I'm going to introduce the program a little bit briefly. So we call it GID, as I said. It's run between the Royal College of Art and Imperial College London, which already makes for a very interesting hybrid experience for the students. And as you can imagine, the title Global Innovation Design doesn't necessarily give away a lot. So for our students, they can't just say, I'm doing Global Innovation Design, because it's not a job title that people know. It's not such an easy thing to understand. But what we do say to them is that it is an opportunity and an experience. It's something that is taking shape as the students go through, that is taking shape as we build a family and taking shape as it develops. So it's a hard thing to explain, but essentially what we like to say is that we think it's a training ground for future design leaders. So we're trying to train people that we think will and have already from previous cohorts gone on to lead design thinking in the companies where they work, in the companies that they set up, and in the practice they do when they get out into the big wide world after they leave here. And so the way that we try and explain this in the program is by these 3 pillars, because the words global innovation design need a bit of unpacking sometimes. So we talk about them as being the pillars of context, impact, and action. And what that means, when you think about context, these kind of global challenges, what our students are doing are asking big questions about the world. And then innovation is really about making an impact and about producing powerful solutions. And then action is that act of doing. And the way the students do is through design, through using design research, through using design methods to build things, through doing things. So at a very high level, this is what global design innovation looks like. GID is a global experience. Our students work for 2 years with us. They spend a chunk of the first year here in London, and then they go on an adventure, either to Tokyo and New York or to Beijing, Singapore, and then they land back here in London to finish off. And this year landed back again all over the world under their various quarantines, doing work from across the planet. And so this happens by partnerships with these incredible universities all across the world, with Keio in Tokyo, with Tsinghua in Beijing, with the Pratt Institute in New York, and with Nanyang in Singapore, where our students actually go and work for a full term in each place as a local student, learning at the feet of the experts there in all of the different disciplines and all of the different ways of working and all of the different cultural experiences of just being in a place that they're not used to. And so when we were preparing this talk, it was very interesting for me when we were chatting to the students about what kind of things they wanted to say about GID. One of the things that kept coming up was what a kind of black box it is. So when you arrive on our website, you want to learn about the program, you see these words here on the left. You see that what we say is GID is this international learning experience, all of this cultural context, multidisciplinary people, and you don't really understand how that translates necessarily to future leaders, people who are catalysts for change. So what we're going to do in this discussion is kind of unpack a bit of this messy squiggle and figure out what these things that we do that are hard to describe are, that kind of change people along their experience and along their journey. So you've heard the kind of mix of backgrounds of disciplines and cultural experiences that already these 3 panelists have come from. And so each of them has had to go through the experience of explaining to other people what GID is. And so I want to start with punting the question out there of, how do you describe GID to people when they ask what you've been doing with your life this last 2 years?
I can take that to start. So often what I end up telling people is that I'm a multidisciplinary designer, an interdisciplinary designer that's studied all over the world. And that comes back to that first word when you put that you ascribe to global and perspective. And that's what I try to tell people my design program is about. It's multidisciplinary in that you can basically pursue whatever sort of design you want, but the context has to be global and it has to be broader than we would normally ascribe to designers.
Yeah, nice. And how? Yeah, go, Sophie.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I would say I've like iterated how I've described it a million times throughout the course, but I think the one thing that it keeps coming back to is the fact that we're all trying to solve different future problems, and that's the kind of link that combines and sort of threads through everyone. But I think it's more about not necessarily how you're doing it or what you're doing, but it's why you're doing it, and that's the kind of thing that keeps kind of coming back and linking us all together throughout the different things that we're exploring and the different things that we're sort of trying to solve or pose solutions to, I guess.
Yeah. To add to that, GID is how it is context-based design. So each person selects a different, and you explore that from all different avenues and different windows possible. And then it could be a physical, or it could be a space, or anything of that sort, as long as it's relevant and the most suited solution for the context of the problem.
That's awesome. Thanks, Malvika. We got most of it, but you were dropping out just a tiny bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, we can hear you well now. And well, maybe I can ask you to expand on it now your connection's working a bit better, and say what I know that you mentioned that you get asked a lot by people who are thinking about applying to GID, which I know is a really good way to try and explain the program. You get asked often about the program. So what is the question you get asked the most often, and what do you say? Oh no.
Cutting out a little bit, and I think it's my internet problem, so I think I'll just drop out and drop in again in a minute.
Come back. Well, maybe actually this is a good opportunity to go on to one of the things that we found with GID is that you guys are used to working with total uncertainty the whole way through your 2 years. We throw you into different group working every couple of weeks, into different global locations, to living in different situations. And so one thing I've been amazed by is how all of you have just taken so naturally to coronavirus working, to what happened. Everyone's just getting on. So can I ask you for how did you find the transition, and what do you think it was about your experience that you're building into your practice now that's equipped you for these times?
Yeah, Rob, go for it.
I was going to say you go for it, but sure. It hasn't been a perfect transition. I couldn't say. It's fortunate that we've worked in this global context. It almost feels like I'm back in Canada right now, and it almost feels like instead of going back to London and operating in 3 locations, I've just expanded that to 4. And so it just becomes another context. It becomes a 4th context instead of a totally brand new context in which to operate. So there's experience from there. It has been tough, I have to say, not being immediately around all my GID friends. There's a lot of energy in the studio where we can bounce ideas off of each other. And that's sort of the core. We go out into the world and get to explore and talk to all kinds of different people and experience all kinds of different things. But there was always that core group of people around us. And I felt that in the context of coronavirus, it's harder to stay connected online than it is in person. So that's where I'd say the transition falls down. But just having the experience setting up shop in a new place all the time definitely makes it easier.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think if there's any course to do to prepare you for something like that, it's probably GID. And I think it hasn't been a perfect transition at all, as Rob says, but I think it definitely, the kind of comfortableness of working within such different environments and moving around and sort of changing your setting constantly, and becoming sort of familiar with different challenges and different mediums to work within and communicating with people via different mediums has definitely been something that we've all become used to whilst trying to communicate with each other in very different contexts. And so I think, it's not been perfect, but I think we've definitely found ways to adapt, which is good.
Malvika, welcome back.
Yeah, I'm sorry I dropped out before, and I missed the question as well. But I do have an idea of what we're discussing.
We're just chatting about how GID students have superpowers now that they're having to work remotely and with uncertainty. And I asked how those were built and what you think has made you a superhuman at this stage in the world.
Yeah, I think the travel did a lot of that, because there was so many things that we didn't expect that we were constantly forced to deal with. and there was no option because we've selected to do this program to the best of our ability. So we're doing justice. We want to do justice to it at every stage, and face and deal with everything that comes our way. So in terms of the travel, mainly, there was so much, I remember so much of disruption when we went to China, particularly for me, where I felt like I was literally picked up and put in a different planet altogether. And the way that I had to cope with that and the way I had to deal with that, it prepared me so much for COVID, to be honest, because the second this happened, I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, not a big deal. I just have to change my plan a little bit. And what I ended up doing, the way I ended up doing it was I was so much more motivated to shift to that change and to put in all my energies to my next plan and detour and try all these different things out without knowing what might work, but still giving my 100% of trying it out. And I think definitely my final project wouldn't have turned out the same way had China not happened. And at the time, it felt like a big thing. It felt like, a very difficult route to take. But it was so helpful in shaping the way that I approach anything that is different now.
Yeah. And actually, it's a really lovely place to weave into a question that we've had from someone in the audience about what is the greatest challenge you face when trying to relate yourselves in those different cultures and those different societies. And so I know that lots of you had interesting culture clash moments and experiences. I know one GID student called them eureka moments, when something clicked and you understood that something wasn't quite how you expected. Do you have any kind of stories to share of difficulty specifically related to that kind of culture clash?
I think for me, I would say China was, it was very easy and difficult to relate to as like both, because there were certain aspects of China which I felt like pulled me back to India, where I was like, okay, fine, the Indian culture thinks very similarly as well. But when it came to surveillance and a lot of other things in terms of how China is run, things were very, very different. And our first instinct was to kind of put in our bias in it in terms of how we've lived life before. So seeing people who are always under surveillance, we made an assumption of how they're unhappy or they lack freedom and things like that. But over time, I think it's just about having an open mind and giving yourself that time to understand something that is a lot beyond you, because you have to question why you built that opinion in the first place. And when you start looking beyond you, you realize that it's not exactly the way you perceived it. And each person in the cohort is perceiving it very differently. So it was very helpful to have those conversations and talk to other people about it. And see how everyone else is perceiving it, because it makes you question where you came from, why you're seeing it like that. And that kind of breaks that little barrier of the bias that you have.
Yeah, I think that for me, there was, I agree with everything Malvika said. I think for me specifically, it was interesting viewing Japanese culture in coming from a British perspective. And I think this idea of politeness was something that I definitely found parallels between the two cultures in a very different way. But I think kind of exploring that idea of how far do you go with being polite for the sake of someone else and sort of restricting your own voice in a way. And I think that for me, there was a definite sort of self-learning that I went through that process and understanding that kind of, well, reflecting on different cultures. And then I think for me, when I moved on to New York, I then felt like I'd had a sort of eureka moment of what I wanted to do. And I think then my process and my work then became a lot clearer from that kind of learning. And I think I then applied that in a very interesting way, which I hadn't expected, which was really nice.
Nice. We're actually getting a thread through the chat, which might be a good thing to start to bring in. And I can't bring in a specific comment, but there seems to be two themes emerging. One is people wanting to know your opinions on the work in the world and what needs to be done. And the other is who you will become in the world and what you want to be doing. So I'm going to lead in, Sophie, from what you were saying about this link between what Malvika was talking about having to examine yourself to understand how you operate in a culture, and then the eureka moment not just being linked to you culturally, but to what kind of work you want to be doing. And maybe I'll pitch this question at Robert and ask, how do you, because Robert, you've worked on some crazy stuff, and maybe you could give a bit of an intro just to what you've been doing the last 6 months, and tell us how you pick what sorts of challenges you want to be working on and how you've kind of focused your attentions or not over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so I've worked on all kinds of interesting stuff. Most recently, I've been working on a medical device that helps people treat episodes of panic attacks, as well as a heart condition called supraventricular tachycardia. And then before that, I was working with firefighters in New York, working on some hand tools and improving the way that their hand tools operate in a biomechanical way. And before that, I was working on an interface for smart devices that's made out of a living plant. So it's this wide variety of things, from the very practical to the very odd. And I think each designer is going to have their own, especially when it's this broad, each designer is going to have their own process for choosing what they work on. For me, my process is very much technology led, whereas I know a lot of my classmates, they have sort of a people led approach, or a people led discovery process, where they go out into the world and they talk to a bunch of people and then find a problem and solve that problem. Whereas for me, I tend to read a lot of stuff that's happening in the world of technology, or just expose myself to a lot of different ideas and think to myself, oh, that's kind of a neat quirk, or that's a neat aspect of some natural system, or the human body, or the way that an institution operates. And then the ideas kind of stem out from there. Like, for example, when I was in New York, I sort of knew I wanted to work with the New York Fire Department. I thought they were just a fascinating organization. And so my mode of discovering problems was just was first to talk to firefighters. And I went to a couple of stations and just talked to them, chatted them up, but also read the entire training manual for New York firefighters, and just read it top to bottom and kind of looked for points where there might be problems hypothetically, and then went back and talked to the firefighters about those problems and uncovered interesting things. So my process, mostly not people-led, but very much poking at the problems and looking at interesting quirks in technology and the natural world, let's say.
Yeah, so I'm bringing up Peter's question to add a bit of context to that answer. It was great to hear the idea of just going out and talking to people and finding challenges and working across them. And so can I ask Sophie and Malvika, how do you decide what stuff you work on? Are you influenced by the cohort, by the world? What do you think happens?
I can take this one. I think for me, it's more, I think I'm definitely one of the people Rob's describing who's more human-centered. But I think for me, it's more about sort of understanding how to, I think what I've learned through the GID is how to kind of link what I felt like before the course were very different skills and interests, and these kind of things were two very different things. And I think through kind of just a sort of process of trial and error, I guess, to a certain extent, just sort of exploring in different ways that I can try and explore that. I guess it's sort of a combination of academic research linked with speaking to people, and then sort of understanding and iterating. And for me, I think it's very important that the people that I'm designing for are very integrated into my process. And I kind of develop these relationships and continue that throughout the journey, so that it's not just a sort of like stop in and out sort of thing where I'm pitching in and getting thoughts on one aspect. It's kind of a more drawn out process where they can be quite heavily involved in the design decisions to a certain extent, and inform those to enable the solution to have kind of greater value for them as well. And kind of, I think a lot of it is, for me, is developing relationships with people very outside of my sort of immediate skills or networks, I guess, and drawing on those different stages.
Yeah, and so yes, it's interesting to mention that contrast, and people can check out the students' work on the show website. But Sophie's work, both in your final project and up to this point, has often spanned between your artistic background and fundamental science. And because Rob came from this engineering background, looking at kind of taking technology and finding interesting applications for it, and looking at interesting ways that it could come to life. But Malvika, again, totally different, because you came from a design background and you worked on some human-centered but intensely personal, very research-heavy, very self-driven work. How did you find your approach changing in the way that you kind of deepened your design practice?
I would say my approach and process, I would see it very similar to what Sophie said, is human-centered. In terms, till an extent, I would say. Not completely, because human-centered is when you do put the user in the center. You gain as much insights from them as you possibly can. But there's at one point that needs to stop, because sometimes people don't always have an idea of what they require. They know what the problem is, but they don't know what might be the solution that works best for them. So in terms of that, I think the research and literature reviews, and in terms of access to conversations with peers and professors and everyone that is there in Imperial and RCA, made such a huge difference, because everyone is bringing in their little insight to what you're putting out there. So you're gathering all of this information, and you have this archive of information that you have, and you're summarizing that and putting it across to many different people who give you their little perspective and insight. And then at some point, you keep all those perspectives together and decide, what do I think is valuable? What do I think I want to work on? What is it that I believe in? And what do I think will be the most valuable output to have out there? So that is what I followed mainly in my process.
Yeah, a tough path, a large thing to put on your shoulders, but interesting. Great to hear about it. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to bring up Myles's question. A few people are asking things about the future. And so this is kind of the big one about, now that you've gone through this transformation, you've used GID as this kind of learning experience to build on the way you want to work. What would happen next? What in 2 to 5 years might life look like?
My perspective on this has changed since I entered GID. I came from a background of engineering, as Leila just mentioned, but also from management consulting. I did a little bit of travel with that. And going into GID, I thought, okay, this is going to be a chance for me to explore design, but I'll probably end up back in management consulting in some form, just with a design spin on it. And my outlook has very much changed in terms of what I want to do. And now I'm leaning much more towards the entrepreneurial side of things. And I'm working on a couple of different startups, but to give you an example, one I'm working on with a couple of guys from London Business School, and we were just having the chat the other day about where do we incorporate this business, and the places that came up were the UK, Estonia, and Abu Dhabi. And so it just hasn't been this question of where being something that we're connected to. It's just the where accompanies the why. And so that kind of gives you a lot more freedom in the way that you operate in the world, and the way that you choose to, or where you choose to live. And that's been the crux of the global innovation design experience for me, is feeling comfortable all over the place.
Yeah. Comfort with the unknown. Sorry, Sophie, go.
Go for it. Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, in terms of like my dream job, again, I would say my kind of future of what I envision as my dream job has completely changed throughout the course. And I think for me, it was very much, as you said before, coming from a more artistic background and being more comfortable with the science and gaining understanding of how to be more, gain more rigor in my approach. And I think for me, what I kind of would be my dream job would be to have my own sort of company of sorts way down the line, and have a team of people that draw from experiences of neuroscience, design, artists, and kind of this very weird mesh, and apply that to a much more human-centered output in terms of looking at where, I guess, a lot of the work that I did before was more to do with luxury markets. And I think there's a lot of, I don't know, I think there's a lot of skills that go into that. And I think applying that level of detail and the level of sort of skill that goes into that and applying it to places and contexts where it can actually, from how I see it, add more value in terms of human health and well-being. I think that would be a really interesting way to address those different problems and sort of shift the conversation towards, having a greater impact for not necessarily a sort of financial outcome, possibly. But yeah, I don't know.
That's awesome. Malvika, yeah.
I think the way that I see my dream job, because this is a question I've been asking myself a lot as soon as all the hand-ins got over, for me, it's less about what it is that I'm doing as an output and more about the process. So what is it that goes into creating whatever it is that I will be creating? I want to be in a space that is collaborative. I want to be in a space that is open-minded, that looks at design as a powerful tool. I want to be in a space where it is easy to advocate for things, but yet I am questioned constantly in a way to grow beyond my understanding of what things are supposed to be like. It's definitely a lot more in terms of everything that goes on in between than what the output is, because the way that I see design now is that it can be a part of absolutely anything, any sector in this world, any single problem, whatever it is, design can fall into that. And everything that goes on inside is what I want to be a part of. So I still do not have the answer of what my dream job would look like. I do want to do something that is similar to what GID has been like, which is very difficult to find in the professional environment, let me be honest. But that's where GID, I think a lot of alumni have created their own job profiles and created their own positions. So that is something that I'm looking to do forward.
Yeah. And so let's carry on this track. We've just had a question in from Raj Shah, who wants, I think this is a good building question for this, as you say, often GID graduates are shaping the work that they're doing in the future. It's very difficult to find a place in a company where you might get to do the type of work you've been doing. Has the last 6 months affected the way you've been thinking about things? Because I wonder if, in a way, that sense of isolation some of you described when I asked about your time in coronavirus, when you were like, yeah, I'm equipped with this and I'm good with change and I have comfort with uncertainty, but I miss having everyone around me and I miss the buzz and things. So you've kind of been flung into working on your own much sooner than most GID students might have to try and battle that. Has that experience shaped what you think you might do afterwards or given you new insights into your own practices?
Yeah, I think for me, the experience was of I guess moving in coronavirus. I think for me, it offered a really interesting point of reflection that I probably wouldn't have otherwise had it not happened. And I think this idea of sort of reevaluating, sort of reassessing what is actually really important to you and what are your core values in the work that you're trying to do. In terms of, you're on your own, you can't be influenced really quite as easily by everything else and everyone else around you. And it gives you a sense of isolation in terms of quite physically, but in terms of your thoughts as well. And I think being able to be comfortable with being on your own and figuring out what is actually the crux of the issue that you're trying to solve, and understanding how you can do that on your own, I think, it's definitely changed my perspective, even just from 6 months ago. And I think it's definitely been a positive thing in a very strange way. But I think it's allowed me to sort of reassess what the work that I'm doing and what the kind of core values are of what I'm trying to achieve. Which, I think has been in a strange way, a really great thing. That would be my take on it.
I can follow up on that. The way that I have seen my outlook change in the last 6 months. I would say that when I started GID, it was all about the grand things. It was all about the big changes in the world that it needed, which is always going to be there. However, that I've seen myself grow, I understand that even the smaller things can make a huge difference. So, for example, when it comes to making a change in the world with a product or a digital solution, in certain contexts, even a small thing like a campaign would actually make a huge difference. So sometimes it's not the fancy things and the big innovations that are actually impactful. It could be something as small as a workshop that is actually impacting the most amount of people. So the way I look at work also changed in terms of how it's not necessarily the big startups or a big self venture, or even being a part of a big organization or being a part of a small startup or being a part of anything, as long as you're bringing your perspective and everything that we've learned within GID, we spread that amongst the people that we're a part of. So that's where I see us being valuable, and my life and my learnings being valuable in that space.
That's great. And actually, I want to use your answer to ask Rob a question, because when we were chatting ahead of this, that idea that small things make a difference and that there's this kind of X factor that can do something and have impact. When I was chatting to Rob about his experiences through GID, he said, I have such a hard time talking to engineers now. Like stepping back into these old disciplines and your own kind of having to understand what design means and how your practice is changing. How has maybe the last 6 months, but maybe the last 2 years changed your outlook? You said that what you want to do afterwards is different. How has it changed your practice?
Well, certainly coming into this from a background of engineering and management consulting, you come from this approach of utilitarianism, of what is the utility of a business function or some aspect of a design, as opposed to what are its aesthetic qualities, what does it really mean for the user. So management consulting and engineering are both ultimately about optimization. In engineering, you might be very focused on, say, creating a bracket, and you got to optimize that bracket so that it's perfect weight and supports the perfect amount of weight. And it's kind of boring, but it's a very utilitarian and practical design. When you move into this broader world of design and how that design actually impacts a final person, the definition of success becomes much broader. And so you move from this utilitarian, very focused vision of what good design is, to something that's much broader, but much more reliant on what the actual interaction with the end user is. Now, I'll give a project that I did as an example. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, I designed this interface that's made out of a plant. In fact, it's up on the DE Summer Show website if you wanted to check it out. Basically what it is, it's this plant called Mimosa pudica that responds to touch naturally. It's a way of protecting itself from predation, where if you touch it, its leaves will fold up. And I took that and I thought, okay, this is a beautiful input. Why don't we use this as a button to control smart devices? Now, if you asked an engineer or a management consultant, or said to an engineer or management consultant, look, this is something that is interesting and worthwhile, they wouldn't believe you, because it's way worse than just a normal switch in basically every way, except that it's beautiful, except that it's interesting, except that the interaction is engaging and fun. And so that's the way I view designs now, is that there's a lot more ways that they can be successful than just in that utilitarian way.
Excellent, thanks, Rob. And so actually, there's a couple of questions in the chat, which is the question that I get asked the most about GID, probably, to be honest. So let me find this one. Here we go. This is the question I receive the most often, is the IDE versus GID. So I have an answer for how GID differs to IDE. And for those listening that might not know, IDE is the sibling program, Innovation Design Engineering. but it's definitely our bigger brother. It's been running for 40 years, massively successful, put loads of incredible people out into the world. And GID is now graduating its 6th cohort, so it's still very young and it's still constantly evolving, and we're still synthesizing in some ways what it means, but in some ways just enjoying allowing each cohort to create their own identity and each student to create their own identity. And so I have lots of opinions because I have to answer the question often, what is IDE versus GID? But I would love to pitch this to you guys. What do you see as the differences on the ground?
I can take that as well too, because it kind of actually lends itself well to my previous answer. I found, if you take a superficial view, GID is the global version of IDE, but the ground level experience, that's not actually what it's like. So IDE tends to be much more technical, as well as, in my experience, they're much more focused on group projects within the cohort as well too. Whereas GID tends to be a little bit less technical, where most people tend to be focused more on people, on social programs, on services, as opposed to things and technology. And then people in GID also tend to pursue sort of their own individual projects, in my experience. We come together to do group projects every once in a while, but the main projects, the banner projects, tend to be more individualized than an IDE.
I think if I could follow up on that, I think it's exactly what you say in terms of that GID is so young in comparison. And I think that is where the difference lies, is that there isn't really a prescribed thing of what GID is or what it should be. And I think that is the exciting thing, that we're very much shaping what it should be. And there really isn't a kind of definition of who we are, because I think as each year's gone along, it's completely shifted and sort of warped according to the people that are involved. And I think it really stems down to who's in the cohort that year that defines what GID is at that moment in time. And I think it's very much evolving as time goes on, and different people and different backgrounds and different sort of skill sets input and place their little mark on GID. And I think that is quite the exciting thing, where it doesn't really have this prescribed thing of it is this. And I think that's one of the hardest things about coming into GID, is that there is no outcome of where you should be in 2 years' time. There's just a big sort of question mark as to who you want to be. And I think that is, I think that would be, for me, be the biggest difference, is this idea of self-exploration and the people being very integral to the program itself.
Yeah, I completely agree with Sophie here, where the way that I've seen IDE is also that it's been there for longer. People tend to go more towards innovation in terms of products or services or, digital solutions, while GID could literally be anything. There is no limit to what the outcome might be. Even if it's a toolkit or even if it's a strategy, it's still completely relevant. And I think having impact and context at the core of it, it makes you as a student question yourself till an extent where you understand what value in design is, what you value in design. So there is this sense of moral compass that comes in, where you're not going to put something out there until you believe in it completely from every single aspect, or you have an idea of the kind of designs you value, or the kind of work you want to be doing, and the kind of things that you would never want to go ahead with because it doesn't match with your designer's moral compass.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And so it's great. Yeah, to give a bit of context, my favorite answer to that question is also along those same lines. And it was something that one of my colleagues said, that they say that IDE is more like a boot camp where you're put through your paces. And I know that one of the IDE tutors, and I love this, is she calls it strategic contamination. Like lots of things are thrown at them in order for them to see the world in different ways. And with you guys, I really do call it strategic uncertainty, and less like a boot camp, but more like personal training. It's like a gym membership where we work with each of you to figure out the thing you're doing and how best to do it along those pillars of kind of global context, impact and innovation and design tools, and figuring out which tools, which problems, which approaches work for you. And so, yeah, that's also exactly how I answer that question. It's good to hear. So I'm going to bring in a question from Valley. Hi, Valley, in the audience. Valley was our second-year tutor helping these guys through the last 6 months of their lives, and she wants to ask, what does it mean for you now, this idea of global, one of these pillars of GID in our post-pandemic world? It's a good one.
Well, I can take that. So it's interesting to see that, global travel in some places is kind of getting this bad rap as being, well, a source of contamination in a way. And it's kind of a shame that we haven't seen in the face of this pandemic a truly global response or global leadership in defining the way that countries should interact with each other. Instead, we're getting this sort of piecemeal response. Deals are being struck on an individual basis, on a unilateral or bilateral basis. And, once you've traveled the world, you just see we're all the same. We're all suffering from the same problem. We should be tackling this together. We should be tackling this in a more unified way.
I think I'd like to follow up on that. The way that I see what happened with the pandemic is the fact that it is global. So that in itself is kind of a sense of uniting people as individuals. There are no boundaries of what we can experience together because we're all in this together. So at that point, all the cultural divisions or the social, economic, geographic divisions that we otherwise have is kind of taken away, because on an individual experiential level, people are going through the same thing. And we're all forced to step up in the same way when it comes to digital connection and, moving forward with life the way that we should be functioning. So there isn't too much difference in fact, I feel like the pandemic made the world a lot more global in itself than it was before.
Yeah. And so actually I can bring up, sorry, Sophie, maybe to prime your answer, maybe. It's a bit in line with this, the idea that the pandemic is now more global. A lot of the things people want to know is practically what that might look like. If we're working, if you guys are all spread out and you're having to work on these challenges. And I know this is something we kind of run drills with you. We get you to work across Skype, across different time zones with people you don't know. So this is something you've done before. Would you have any advice on in this context of global working when you can't be in the same room as someone?
So say something.
Yeah, sorry, Sophie. In the deep end.
Question, sorry.
You can also answer the last question. And what does global mean to you?
Maybe I'll do a mix of the two. I think, I for sure that it's not the same as working with all of the GID cohort together. And I think that, yeah, as we said at the beginning, like it's been a shame that we haven't been able to finish all together and have each other to bounce off. But I think there's still so much value in being able to work with people cross-disciplinary. And I think actually that was one of the big things that I felt like I had to develop and push probably a lot more than I would have done if I was in the studio, was collaboration, because I think my background as a textile designer lends itself very well to physical outcomes, and digital outcomes is not something that I'm as comfortable with producing in the same way that I would be. And so I think actually having to reach out and draw on people's skills who are better at that sort of facilitation, have those skills, and learn from people who have those different skill sets in a more digital way has forced me to create those relationships, I guess. And it's still been very much a kind of similar sense of collaboration, I guess, even though it's not been in the same room. I think it still had the same outcome as it probably would do if we were working together physically. yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
It does, and it's great to see. There are so many interesting questions in the chat, and we can't answer them all because we're coming up to the end of the hour very soon, and so this answers perfectly some of the other questions as well that are in there. So that's great. I want to now seed as we're coming to the end with some kind of bigger themes, and so some of the questions are around. We started out this discussion around that kind of squiggle, the magic of GID between all of these kind of ingredients that we put together and where you land. And one prospective student is asking this. We've also got a question in the chat. I'm not sure I can bring both up. Can I? No. From Stephen Green, which I love, is, are the periods studying overseas essential to GID? And we have this question from a prospective student of how best to prepare. And I think in a way, these questions both speak to the heart of what GID is. And so for me, this thing that we were talking about, the idea that for each of you, it's about building your own practice. It's this idea of personal boot camp. In GID, we call it the vision. And we ask people what their vision work is and how they're working. And so I see this as kind of one of the core things. But so my advice to people is always just, it's a mindset of preparedness to come and make the most out of it. But what would you guys say? What advice would you give to other people coming in? And what do you think is that kind of magic at the heart of GID?
I would definitely say that whatever it is that you're faced with in GID, give it your 100%. Whatever it is, whether you're comfortable with it or not, no matter what comes your way, just give it your 100% and you will get the best out of the course that you can get.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think for me, it's about openness and a kind of certain honesty that you have to give yourself, to allow yourself to kind of be open to all the things that you think might not make sense or might not make sort of, I don't know, much logical sense in terms of how you see yourself or all the different things that you might be interested in or want to explore. But I think the thing that links it all together is you. And I think being able to have the confidence to sort of see how those different things link together and be open to all the different experiences that you can have on the program is the kind of specialness and the magic.
I would basically just reinforce what Malvika said as well too. If you're coming to the program, it is about giving 100%. Wherever I see people falling down in the program, it tends not to be an issue of them not being talented or not being interested or not having the skills. It's you have to bring the motivation and the want to explore whatever you're going to explore and go at it 100% fully. It can be difficult and demotivating to be dropped into these new contexts and totally have to reestablish yourself and totally have to rebuild the framework with which you work all the time, over and over and over again. That's the uncertainty aspect. But you have to bring the self-confidence and bring the effort every single day, or it's quite easy to kind of coast and not get as much out of it.
Yeah, thanks. And so when we were preparing this chat, one of the things we were talking about was exactly that kind of, you land in London with a bunch of strangers, we ask you to work together, and everybody has this kind of crisis in the first term of who am I and what am I working on and what do I exist for and what am I good at anymore and what even is life? And there's kind of always a small orientation of feeling like you're outside your comfort zone all the time is exhausting. And not understanding where your skills are while you're trying to build new ones is really difficult. And so how do you feel like you got past that kind of crisis point? What did you learn from pushing yourself beyond your discipline? And what advice would you have to other people who might want to do the same?
For me personally, it was about understanding that within GID as a cohort, you can't position yourself anywhere. You cannot compare yourself with other people at all. So it's difficult in an academic setting because we're so used to being given a grade or being used to told where we stand. But in GID, you just cannot. And it's not fair to yourself if you do that because everyone's skill sets are so different. So you have to break that little ego that wants you to get that sort of position And instead, you have to be open enough to learn from every single individual around you, because that's your only way of growing. So I remember we had this coding class, which was intentional interactions, and everyone created, most of the people created these crazy like coded things. And I was just like, wow, I am so bad at this, because I had no idea about coding. I'd never read a code. I didn't know what it meant. And I was so demotivated at that point, because I was like, I'm the lowest in class. But when I start thinking about, no, I have learned how to code this amount, I can read this language, I can understand it. I'm like 10 steps ahead from what I was before. So understanding that your value is not according to where you stand, your value lies in how you can learn and how you can make yourself competent in anything instead of where you are at right now. That was my biggest learning.
That's great.
Yeah, I know we're running short on time, but I think for me it's the idea of like the pace of the first year, which was so valuable. I think being able to work in so many different teams with such different people with such different skills, you get to sort of reimagine yourself throughout all those different projects and sort of explore and trial and error all the things, all the different roles that you might want to take. And I think that what that role looks like is very different depending on who you're in a team with or who you're working on a project with, what project is. But I think the kind of ability and the freedom to explore quite freely all these different roles and different sort of disciplines that you might think is what you want to do, and then you suddenly do a project, you're like, Christ, that's not me at all. But you kind of have that ability to do it, and you can fail without there being a massive consequence, which I think if you're doing a kind of, and if you're employed in a company, you don't have that level of freedom and exploration to make the same mistakes, which I think is where GID becomes very valuable, and you kind of can very quickly iterate all the things that you might want to explore within yourself without having the same sort of level of risk involved, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that I spend a lot of my time just permission giving people to try stuff and to do things. And I know that a lot of people need that kind of space to explore, and it is so important and it is so rare. Robert, any last thoughts? I think this is a really nice question to finish on, if you have any insights.
Well, actually, I just want to address some aspect of that last question that we got from, I think it was KRI.
Yeah.
So specifically, they mentioned it was advice for younger students. And we were kind of giving general advice. So let me try to give advice for a younger student, because the three of us, we each have work experience, but that's not necessarily true of everybody in GID. And I found that having that work experience has been really helpful. And you see the students who have work experience come in and they're able to orient themselves a little bit better, because one, they're not fresh out of that environment of undergrad where they're being graded all the time, as Malvika mentions, and it's very structured. GID is very unstructured. And then they're also coming back into this, they're choosing to come back into the academic world. And it becomes a very conscious choice rather than sliding from one academic program into the next. So if you're young, if you're choosing this program, just make sure that you're doing it with intention. That's the way that I would put it. Do it with intention. It's going to be tough and it's broad and it's about exploration, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't come in with that intention.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Robert. Excellent advice to end on. And that is it. We're in the last minute, so we're running up against everybody's lunch hour. But thank you so much for giving up your time to chat to me today and over the last week about this. It's been such a pleasure reliving it. And this is the first of many talks. So these guys, you can see their work online following the links underneath. And it's the first in like a couple of weeks worth of events and celebrations. So keep your eyes peeled and keep in touch if you want to know more. We also have our website launching today at GID.London, www.gid.london. if you want to see more specifically about the GID family and about the program. So I'm going to say thank you again to you, panel, and say goodbye to do the finishing bits. Lovely to see your faces. And thank you to the rest of you for coming to join us over this lunch and for being so active in the chat. It's always lots of fun for us to see how other people perceive the things that we're doing here every day and to hear what kinds of questions you want to ask. So thank you for participating and for giving up your time. Again, please do check out the website link below at desummershow.london, where you'll be able to see the students' work, not just from GID, but all the other design engineering programs. And there's more, thank you. And there's more events coming up across this week as well. Lots more talks every lunchtime up until the end of the week. So do check out the events that are happening. And thank you again for joining us. It's been a total pleasure. I hope to see you soon.